Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the strangest dinner parties in history. Creepy medieval food rituals. The ones where the food wasn't just a meal, it was a ritual. Forget everything Hollywood told you. This isn't kings politely sipping wine. Nope. This is the stuff that makes you question if you're even hungry anymore. So before you get too comfortable, hit that like button if you love these weird history deep dives, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe grab a snack, actually. On second thought, maybe don't. And let's jump in. Picture this. The fire's low. Shadows crawl along the rough stone walls like they've got secrets to tell. And from somewhere in the hall, a lute plucks the same 3 haunting notes over and over. The air is heavy, not with the smell of fresh cookies or coffee, but with something you can't quite place. It's smoky, meaty, and faintly sour, like someone tried to mop the floor with a warm ale. You're not in your cozy kitchen anymore. You're seated at a long, creaky table in a world where a meal isn't just eaten, it's performed. Where bread might carry blessings or curses. People don't just pass plates here. They pass meaning, tradition, and sometimes, frankly, questionable science. A man in a fur-trimmed robe slams a wooden mug down beside you, nearly splashing your sleeve. He grins, revealing teeth the color of stale parchment, and says, "It begins." You're about to ask what begins, but the answer comes in the form of a drumbeat. Slow, deep, echoing. The room quiets. Torches flicker. A hush sweeps over the crowd like a sudden chill, and you notice everyone turning toward the great double doors at the far end of the hall. You open, and there it is, a sight that both impresses and unsettles you in equal measure. From the shadows, a group of servants step forward, carrying something large, glistening and oddly smiling. A whole boar's head, roasted to perfection, or what medieval people thought was perfection, sitting proudly on a silver platter, an apple wedged in its mouth, like it's in on the joke. The boar's head ritual has begun. You blink awake, your head still heavy from whatever was in that last drink, if it was a drink. The first thing you notice is the smoke thick and clinging, swirling up toward the timbered ceiling, where soot stains look centuries old. The second thing you notice is the smell. It's not one smell, but a dozen, all fighting for dominance. The rich, greasy perfume of roasting meat. The sharp tang of vinegar-soaked vegetables. Something fishy, no. Really fishy, like someone spilled a barrel of pickled herring last week and just left it. And underneath it all, a faint metallic bite, the unmistakable scent of fresh blood. The hall is alive. Wooden mugs slam on rough tables, the thud echoing in the rafters. Laughter erupts, full and raw, mouths open wide, half-chewed food on display. The flicker of torches catches on greasy foreheads and gold rings, casting moving shadows that make everyone look just a little more monstrous. You look down, there's a wooden trencher in front of you. It's stained dark from years of use, maybe decades. Beside it, a knife that looks more like a dagger. You glance to your left. A woman in a patched wool dress dips a crust of bread into something red and steaming. She catches you staring and says, "Eat, it's good luck." You smile politely, deciding not to ask good luck for who. Somewhere near the head table, a drum beat begins. Slow, measured. The crowd starts to hush. You follow their gaze and see servants carrying the great boar's head glistening, grinning, an apple clenched between its teeth toward the center of the hall. The smell of it hits you before it reaches the table. Smoky fat, sweet apple, and just a whisper of something off. The singers begin their song, voices deep and solemn, honoring the beast. And yet, just behind that procession, you spot another platter, one not sung about, one far less ceremonial. A slab of dark bread, its crust shiny, almost black. Your stomach knots, because you've heard whispers about that bread. Bread kneaded not just with flour, but with warm, fresh animal blood. The blood bread ceremony. And as the boar's head is placed before the lord of the manor, that other platter starts making its way down the tables closer, closer, until it stops right in front of you. The server smiles. Eat, they say. It's tradition. The boar's head ritual. The procession moves slowly, almost ceremonially, the way you'd expect a king to be carried to his throne, only this king is roasted, glazed, and smiling with a mouthful of apple. Two servants in wool tunics lead the way, holding candles so close the wax drips down onto their hands, but they don't flinch. Behind them, 4 men carry the silver platter, arms straining under its weight. The head itself glistens in the firelight, skin pulled tight and glossy, like someone spent hours polishing it with oil. The boar's eyes are glassy, staring straight ahead, as if it can still see the feast it's about to preside over. The apple in its mouth gleams, its red skin almost too perfect, like it's daring you to bite it. And the smell, oh, the smell, a heavy, smoky sweetness that wraps around you, making you both hungry and just a little uneasy. A man in a fur-trimmed robe, clearly the lord of the manor, stands to receive it. He raises a goblet high, and the singing begins. It's not a cheery carol. It's deep, droning, almost like a chant, echoing off the hall's stone walls. Caput apri defero. The voices intone Latin words you don't understand, but you can feel their weight. Everyone joins in, except you, sitting there pretending you totally know what's happening. The head is placed in the center of the table, like an honored guest. Everyone's eyes turn to it, not to the people around them, as if the meal doesn't start until it allows it to. A serving knife the size of a short sword is laid beside it, and the lord makes the first cut, slicing into the cheek with practiced precision. A wedge of meat is lifted onto a trencher and passed down, toward you. The hall watches. Are you really going to refuse the centerpiece of the most important feast of the year? And here's where I have to stop and ask, if someone served you a roasted animal head as the main attraction, would you take a bite out of respect, or quietly slide it to the person next to you? Comment below, because I need to know how many of you are braver than me. All right. Pause for a second. You've just been handed a steaming slice of boar's cheek, fresh from the head of the beast that's been staring at you since it entered the room. The entire hall is waiting. It's not like at modern dinner parties, where you can politely decline and claim you're watching your carbs. Nope. Here, refusing food is almost an insult, and an insult at a feast could easily turn into a duel. So, what would you do? Would you take the bite, smile, and hope you don't taste whatever's been staring at you? Or would you quietly nudge it onto your neighbor's plate and pretend you already ate yours? I mean, be honest in today's world. We get squeamish over chicken nuggets if they look too real. Here, these people are proudly making eye contact with dinner. Drop your answer in the comments, team bite, if you'd take it, or team slide if you'd pass it along. I'm keeping track. The truth is, whether you're brave or not, this is just the opening act of the feast. Because while the boar's head is busy commanding everyone's attention, something else is making its way down the long tables. At first, you barely notice it, a wooden platter, dark and unassuming, carried by a young servant in a plain tunic. But as it gets closer, the torchlight reveals a loaf of bread unlike any you've ever seen. Its crust is deep brown, almost black, with a glossy sheen that catches the firelight. You lean forward, curious. Then the smell hits you warm, earthy, and faintly metallic. You remember a whisper you overheard earlier. Blood bread. And just as the platter stops in front of you, the servant says a single word, "Eat," and sets it down. You glance at the boar's head, still watching from the center of the table, then at the bread. Suddenly, you realize the strangest part of this feast hasn't even started yet. The platter sits in front of you now, and the longer it stays there, the heavier the air feels. It's not just bread, it's a statement. The loaf's crust gleams with an oily sheen, cracked in places like parched earth. Wisps of steam curl from the torn end, carrying a smell that confuses your senses, rich and yeasty like fresh baking, but laced with that iron tang you know from the taste of a bitten lip. The servant doesn't move until you pick it up. So you do. It's heavier than you expected, dense, solid, like it could double as a weapon if the feast turned into a brawl. You glance around the table. Other guests are already breaking off hunks and dipping them into bowls of dark gravy. A few are licking their fingers, red stains streaking their knuckles. You notice nobody's making polite conversation now. They're quiet, focused. This isn't casual eating. This is participation. You tear off a piece. The inside is moist, almost spongy, a deep reddish brown. Your fingers come away with faint crimson smudges. And then you remember the whispers. Fresh animal blood, whisked with flour, spices, maybe a little honey to balance the metallic bite. Sometimes pig, sometimes ox. Always warm, always made the same day as the slaughter, because the blood must be alive when it meets the dough. You hesitate. The man across from you, a burly fellow with half a beard and twice the enthusiasm, grins and says, "Good for strength, good for winter." He takes a bite big enough to choke a lesser man, chewing slowly, eyes fixed on yours. There's no way out. You take a small bite, expecting something horrible. Instead, it's oddly rich. Savory, slightly sweet, almost like pumpernickel, but with a metallic aftertaste that clings to the back of your tongue. It's not bad, but it's also not forgettable. The lord of the manor raises his goblet and calls out a toast. The hall echoes with shouts. Blood for the land, bread for the body. And just like that, you realize this isn't just about eating. This is about making sure the spirit of the animal, the bounty of the harvest, and the strength of the community all become part of you. Literally. You wipe your fingers on your tunic, thinking maybe the strangest part of the night is over. But then, from the far end of the hall, a loud trumpet blares, and someone shouts, "Bring forth the Lord of Misrule." The guests erupt in laughter, hats are swapped, mugs are spilled, and you get the sinking feeling that whatever's about to happen will make the blood bread seem almost normal. The Feast of Fools. The trumpet blast is so loud, it rattles the wooden plates on the table. The chatter dies down, but not into silence. No, this is the kind of pause you get before a thunderstorm, when the air itself feels like it's holding its breath. And then the doors burst open. In stumbles a man wearing what looks like half a bishop's robe and half a jester's outfit, a crooked crown on his head made entirely out of twisted bread rolls strung together with a ribbon. His face is painted crudely with soot and wine stains, giving him the look of someone who's just survived both a bar fight and a carnival. This is the Lord of Misrule, chosen for the night to command the feast in the most absurd, chaotic way possible. He doesn't sit at the head table, oh no. He struts straight to the lord of the manor, snatches his fur-lined seat, and plops down with a grin that could curdle milk. The crowd roars. This isn't disrespect. This is tradition. For one night a year, the hierarchy flips upside down. Peasants pretend to be nobles, nobles act like servants, and nobody escapes the madness. Food is brought in, but not the kind you'd expect. Someone sets down a pie, steaming and golden, and the Lord of Misrule announces, "Tonight's delicacy, pig snout surprise." You think he's joking until the pie is sliced open and, sure enough, little boiled pig snouts poke out like they're trying to escape. People cheer. Someone to your left actually claps. The rules of the feast are nonsense. If the Lord of Misrule points at you, you have to stand and make a toast, but you can't use words, only exaggerated chewing motions. If he slaps the table, everyone has to swap seats, which means swapping whatever was on your plate too. You watch a plate of eel-stuffed pancakes change hands 4 times in 1 minute, and each time the new owner looks less enthusiastic. It's rowdy, it's ridiculous, and it's just a little bit dangerous because with the ale flowing like water and dignity thrown out the window, there's no telling when the fun might tip into a fistfight. Somewhere behind you, you hear a crash. A platter of roast turnips hits the floor, and someone slips on it mid-laugh. The Lord of Misrule is loving it. He grabs a roasted chicken leg, points it at you like a scepter, and shouts, "You, the quiet one, swap your bread with the fellow 2 seats down." You glance at your loaf, the blood bread. The man 2 seats down is holding a plate piled with something that looks disturbingly gelatinous. You make the swap and instantly regret it. And honestly, sitting here, juggling eel pancakes and pig snout pie while a man in a bread crown makes up rules as he goes, it hits you. This is the medieval version of a reality TV dinner party, the kind where you know something is going to end up on the floor, someone's going to cry, and you're not sure if the food is part of the challenge or the punishment. Holding your new plate, a gelatinous wobbling mound that shimmers ominously in the firelight, and it hits you. This is basically the medieval version of a chaotic reality TV dinner party. Picture it. Instead of a sleek studio set and perfect lighting, you've got a smoky hall where the candles drip wax onto the table, onto the food, and occasionally onto people's hair. Instead of Gordon Ramsay yelling at chefs, you've got the Lord of Misrule, a slightly drunk man in a bread crown, yelling at you to eat something that looks like it belongs in a surgeon's bucket, not on a dinner plate. And the challenges? Forget mystery box cooking. Here, the mystery is whether you're going to find a fish eyeball in your pudding. Forget contestants politely complimenting each other's plating. Here, if you drop your food, the person next to you will scoop it off the floor and eat it without blinking, because hey, waste not, want not. It's like MasterChef meets Fear Factor, but without the cash prize or the safety inspections. And the audience? Oh, they're not watching from home. They're in the game. Every person in this hall is both a contestant and a judge. willing to laugh at your discomfort and cheer when you gag on something suspiciously chewy. You're not even sure if the applause is for you surviving a bite, or for the fact that you didn't spit it back onto the table. The more you think about it, the more you realize. In medieval times, the dinner table wasn't just for eating. It was the entertainment. Food wasn't background noise. It was the main act, the conversation starter, the punchline. And here you are, right in the middle of the show, waiting for the next course, the wedding pottage. And as the laughter dies down and the bread crown tilts dangerously on the Lord of Misrule's head, you notice servants carrying in a new arrival, a cauldron so big it takes 3 people to carry. Steam rises from it in thick curls, smelling faintly of oats, meat, and... is that cabbage? A bride and groom step forward, holding hands, smiling nervously. Whatever's in that pot, you're about to find out. It's not just soup. The great hall falls into an expectant hush, the kind of hush that makes you wonder if you're about to witness a touching romantic moment, or the start of a culinary crime scene. The doors creak open, and in comes a procession. At the front, 3 burly men, red-faced from effort, carrying a cauldron so massive it looks like it was stolen from a dragon's lair. Steam billows out of it in ghostly clouds, curling up to the rafters. Behind them, the bride and groom, young, wide-eyed, and smiling the awkward smile of people who know the spotlight is on them, but also that something slightly embarrassing is about to happen. The crowd leans forward, eyes glittering. Now, in your modern brain, you're expecting maybe a wedding cake reveal. Something tiered, something elegant, something Instagrammable. But this is the Middle Ages, and instead of delicate sponge and buttercream, the star of the show is a thick, bubbling swamp of pottage. Pottage wasn't just one recipe, it was everything. Meat? Throw it in. Vegetables? In it goes. Bread? Why not that questionable bit of yesterday's stew? Yep, it's in there too. The smell is complicated. It's warm and hearty, sure, but also faintly sour, with a whisper of something fishy. You can't tell if that's deliberate or just the smell of a pot that's been cooking for several days without being washed. And here's the tradition. The newlyweds must feed each other from this cauldron. Why? Because it symbolizes unity, abundance, and maybe tests whether your spouse can keep a straight face when you hand them a spoonful of something that looks like it's still alive. The bride scoops up the first ladleful. It's chunky. There's a carrot, a shred of cabbage, and oh dear, what might be the tail of a small fish. She hesitates for just a second before holding it up to the groom, smiling like this is the most romantic thing in the world. He takes the bite, chews slowly, and the crowd roars approval. Then it's his turn. The groom digs deep, way down into the pottage, and comes up with something unidentifiable. It jiggles ominously on the spoon. The bride's smile twitches, but she leans forward and takes it. A single heroic chew later, she swallows, and the hall erupts into cheers. Now, here's the kicker. After this romantic exchange, the pottage is shared with the guests. Big wooden bowls are passed around, and ladles dip deep into the steaming mix. You get your portion thick, brown, and with a mysterious floating object you decide not to identify. It's warm, it's filling, and surprisingly, not terrible. Still, you can't shake the feeling that somewhere in here, a slice of last month's dinner might be lurking. The hidden surprise feast. As you're halfway through your bowl, the Lord of Misrule claps his hands. Servants rush in with covered platters, smaller, shinier, and giving off a tantalizing smell. The crowd stirs with excitement, and whispers fly. This is the real feast, the one they've been hiding. But when the lids come off, you realize nothing could have prepared you for what's inside. The ritual of the blessed loaf. The hall smells of wood smoke and damp stone, but above it all drifts the warm, almost intoxicating scent of fresh bread. It's the kind of smell that should make mouths water. But here, no one licks their lips. No one fidgets in hunger. Because in this village, bread, at least this bread, is not just food. It's a barrier, a weapon, a shield against whatever they believe stalks the night. From the shadowed doorway, a monk enters, hood drawn low, his brown robe swaying like heavy curtains with each measured step. In his hands, swaddled in white linen, rests a single loaf. It's large enough to feed an entire family for a week, its crust baked to a deep golden brown. But the way the villagers stare at it wide-eyed, almost afraid, makes it clear this is no ordinary loaf. He walks slowly, deliberately, down the center of the room, the crowd parting for him as if he carries something dangerous. The candlelight flickers over his face, revealing a mouth moving in constant, soundless prayer, or maybe incantation. The tension is thick enough to hear your own heartbeat. When he reaches the long oak table, he lays the bread down with surprising gentleness, as though it's something alive. He doesn't reach for a knife. Instead, his gnarled fingers dig into the crust, tearing it open with a slow, steady force. A soft hiss of steam escapes, carrying a strange fragrance, not just yeast and flour, something sharper. The smell is earthy, medicinal, and faintly bitter. Your mind turns to herbs you've read about: rosemary, yarrow, mugwort plants used in medieval remedies, and in rituals to ward off evil. As the monk works, he speaks in a low murmur. Not Latin, not the language of the church you'd expect from a man of God. This is older, more guttural. It flows like the mutter of a river at night, words you're certain no Bible contains. One by one, villagers step forward, holding small wooden bowls with both hands, heads bowed. The monk places a piece of the bread into each bowl. But no one eats. Not a single bite passes a single lip. Because this bread isn't meant for supper. It's meant for thresholds, for hanging above doors, for burying under barn floors. Some will crumble it into wells to keep the water pure. Others will tuck it beneath pillows to keep the nightmares out. The ritual isn't about filling stomachs. It's about fortifying souls. The monk gives the last piece to an old woman whose hands shake so badly she nearly drops it. He pulls back, and the room is still again. Still but not silent. From the far corner, you hear it. A metallic clang, then another, then a third. The sound of a spoon striking the rim of a great brass pot. The monk's head lifts at the sound, and a ripple moves through the crowd, not of joy, but of unease. They know what comes after the bread. The warm glow of the ritual begins to fade from the room, replaced by the cold anticipation of what's next. Because the brass pot is the signal for the next part of the night's gathering. A part where fear takes center stage. And that is where Scene 10 begins. The black feast of shadows. The hall is hushed now. The raucous laughter, the clinking goblets, even the slow scrape of knives on trenchers, all fade into a kind of thick, expectant silence. At the far end of the table, the great oak doors swing open without a sound, as if moved by an unseen hand. A wave of cold air seeps in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, faint smoke, and something sweet, like honey left too long in the dark. From the shadows emerges a small procession. Not priests, not servants, but figures wrapped head to toe in deep, ashen robes. They move in unison, their steps slow and deliberate, as though each one is keeping time with a silent drum only they can hear. In their hands, they carry a single dish, each not silver platters or golden bowls, but heavy, blackened stone plates that seem older than the castle itself. On them rests a meal you cannot quite name. Glossy, ink-dark morsels glistening in the torchlight, surrounded by a syrup so dark it swallows the light around it. A murmur rises at the table. No one dares speak too loudly. This is not the kind of course you ask questions about. The nobles straighten their posture. The servants avert their eyes. Everyone knows this is the Feast of Shadows, a course served only when the Lord wishes to invoke blessings from whatever dwells beyond the veil. One of the robed figures stops behind the head seat, lowering their plate with reverence. The Lord, a gaunt man, whose rings are heavier than his fingers can bear, lifts a piece of the dark delicacy and holds it up for all to see. No one eats until he takes the first bite. And when he does, his expression barely changes, yet the flicker of a candle reveals the faintest tremor in his hand. The rest follow suit. The taste, they say, is unlike anything in the living world, bitter at first, then cloyingly sweet, and finally leaving a strange, metallic echo on the tongue, as though the food itself carries a memory you were never meant to share. The robed servers remain, watching in silence until every plate is empty. Only then do they vanish back through the door that they came from, leaving no sound but the low crackle of fire and the uneasy breaths of the diners. A servant collects the last blackened plate, but instead of leaving the hall, he walks toward a side passage, one that leads deeper beneath the castle. Down there, in the hidden chambers, the next ritual waits. And it has nothing to do with eating. The descent beneath the banquet. The side passage yawns open like the mouth of a sleeping beast, narrow, damp, and smelling faintly of iron and mold. The torchlight from the hall doesn't reach far. After just a few steps, the air turns cooler, heavier, as though you've stepped into another world entirely. The servant carrying the last blackened plate moves with purpose, his boots silent on the worn stone steps. These stairs spiral downward, hugging the cold walls. With every turn, the faint rumble of the feast above grows more distant, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum. At first, it sounds like wind through the cracks, but then it takes on the cadence of human voices, chanting in a language older than the kingdom itself. The walls here are not the smooth, proud masonry of the castle's upper levels. They are rough-hewn rock, wet to the touch, streaked with mineral veins that glimmer faintly in the flickering torchlight. Now and then, carved symbols appear, some chiseled deep into the stone, others scrawled hastily in what looks like ash or something darker. The air thickens as the passage opens into a long, low chamber. Candles crowd every surface, short stubs, tall spires, some melted into grotesque shapes, where wax has pooled and hardened into miniature landscapes. Their flames gutter and sway, yet they never seem to go out. At the center of the room, a circle has been drawn on the floor in a mixture of powdered herbs and what might be dried blood. Inside that circle stands a tall iron brazier, its coals glowing a deep, unnatural crimson. The chanting grows louder now, and its source becomes clear. 6 hooded figures, their robes stitched with shimmering thread that catches the light like strands of spider silk. They stand in perfect formation, their hands raised in a slow, deliberate rhythm that seems to pull the air in and out of the chamber itself. The servant steps forward, placing the blackened plate on a low stone altar beside the brazier. The chanting pauses not abruptly, but with a slow, rolling stop, like waves fading after a storm. One of the hooded figures steps forward and lowers their hood, revealing eyes the color of polished onyx and skin so pale it looks almost carved from candle wax. Without a word, they lift the plate and place it atop the coals. A hiss echoes through the chamber as the syrup from the feast drips into the fire, releasing a thick, sweet-smelling smoke. The smell is almost intoxicating, a strange mix of honey, charred herbs, and something metallic. It fills your lungs in an instant, making your vision blur at the edges. The hooded leader speaks low, resonant, and in that same forgotten tongue. Though the words are foreign, their weight is unmistakable. This is an invitation, a beckoning to something that is not meant to walk among men, but will, if properly fed. The coals flare brighter. Shadows shift unnaturally on the walls, bending and stretching as though they belong to something else entirely. The room hums with unseen energy, and in that moment, you realize the feast above was only the offering. What's about to happen now is the collection. Before you can steady yourself, the chanting resumes faster now, urgent, like a heartbeat racing toward its limit. The smoke swirls low to the ground, curling toward the chamber's far wall, where a sealed archway begins to tremble. Something on the other side stirs, eager, answering the call. The honeyed wine of oaths. The long tables groan beneath the weight of trenchers and pitchers, but all attention is fixed on one vessel, a massive goblet of honeyed wine, thick and golden, catching the torchlight like molten amber. This isn't just a drink, it's a declaration. In the medieval mind, mead wasn't merely fermented honey, it was the very nectar of truth, binding words to fate. When a man or woman lifted this cup before witnesses, they weren't just sipping sweetness. They were making a promise the gods themselves were expected to overhear. The first sip is slow, ceremonial. The warmth creeps through the body like a spell, loosening the tongue but weighing down the heart with the seriousness of what's been spoken. A promise to protect a friend, avenge a wrong, or marry before winter's end once drunk over mead. It was believed to cling to your soul as stubbornly as the sticky sweetness clings to your lips. Breaking such a vow wasn't just dishonorable, it was an invitation for misfortune to find you. And in medieval superstition, misfortune always accepted the invitation. Sometimes the wine was passed hand to hand, each drinker repeating or affirming the words spoken by the first. Other times, it was poured into smaller cups, each vessel meant to carry the same fate-laden liquid. This ritual could mark the sealing of a pact between rival houses, the swearing of loyalty to a liege lord, or even the silent, unspoken bond between two conspirators in a shadowed corner. Bedtime. And if you think it was all grand halls and noble faces, think again. These oaths happened in crowded taverns too, among rough traders and traveling mercenaries. The surroundings didn't matter. The belief in the drink's binding power did. You can almost hear the scraping of chairs as the final drinker lowers the goblet, the fire popping in the hearth, the low hum of the hall resuming after the heavy silence of the vow. And just as the last echo of that sacred promise fades, another cup is brought forward. But this one isn't for truth. It's for something far stranger, and perhaps far more dangerous. The cursed cup. The hall grows quieter as the next vessel appears, not golden like the mead cup, but blackened, as if it had been pulled from a fire long ago. Its surface is pitted, the rim uneven, the kind of object you'd expect to find buried under centuries of ash, rather than set upon a table. A faint, metallic tang rides the air before it even reaches the drinker's hands. This was no cup of friendship or trust. It was the cursed cup, a drinking vessel used in certain medieval punishments and tests of truth. Legend said it belonged to a lord who betrayed his people, and every soul who drank from it afterward would inherit a portion of his shame unless, of course, they were pure of heart. But purity in the Middle Ages was a dangerous claim to make, because this test was often used by those who already suspected your guilt. The liquid within could be anything, a bitter herbal concoction, an unaged wine so sour it clawed at the throat, or a mixture laced with ingredients meant to churn the stomach. Drinking it without grimacing was said to prove innocence. Spitting it out, coughing, or refusing the sip altogether was considered proof of treachery. Sometimes it wasn't even about truth at all. In dimly lit taverns, local troublemakers would force newcomers to drink from the cursed cup as a rite of humiliation, laughing as the victim's face twisted at the taste. In rural villages, superstitious folk used it to cleanse the soul of someone thought to be harboring bad luck or worse, the evil eye. Imagine it. The flicker of torchlight on the blackened rim, the room leaning in, the silence pressing against your ears as you take that first swallow. The liquid bites not a pleasant heat like spiced wine, but a sharp, bitter sting that seems to scrape down the throat. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you can't help but wonder if the curse is just a story, or if it's curling inside you already, waiting for nightfall. And yet, even this was not the strangest drink of the medieval table. For there was another one not born of punishment or honor, but of something older, more primal, something brewed for the dead. The funeral mead. If the cursed cup was a test of the living, then the funeral mead was an offering for both the living and the dead, a drink steeped in superstition, memory, and the heavy scent of grief. The tradition was simple in form, but rich in meaning. When someone of importance passed away, a respected elder, a warrior, or even a feared lord, a great drinking vessel would be prepared. Into it went honey wine, dark ale, or sometimes a strong spiced brew meant to warm mourners through a cold, bitter night. But this was no ordinary feast drink. It was blessed and cursed in equal measure. You see, funeral mead wasn't just about toasting the departed. In some parts of medieval Europe, it was believed that a sip of the drink connected you to the spirit of the one who had passed. You weren't just honoring their memory, you were, in a way, inviting them into you. That was why the drink was often shared in a single communal cup, passed slowly around a circle of mourners, each person taking one deep swallow before passing it on. Imagine sitting there, the room heavy with smoke from burning pine resin, the air thick with the sweet sour aroma of the mead. Shadows from the fire lick the rafters, making faces seem older, more hollow. The cup comes to you, warm from the last hands that held it. You lift it, and for a moment, the chatter fades. Your mind whispers, what if they really are here? What if they're watching me now? Some accounts tell of mourners swearing they felt a sudden chill as they drank, as if icy fingers traced the rim of the cup. Others claimed to hear faint whispers just beneath the crackle of the fire. And there were darker tales, ones in which the final sip of the funeral mead was reserved for the closest kin, who, by swallowing it, accepted not only the inheritance of land or title, but also the burden of the spirit. But the truly unsettling part? In certain remote villages, the funeral mead wasn't just for the living. A small portion of it was poured directly into the open grave, feeding the departed on their journey to the other side. The belief was that this act would keep them content and prevent them from wandering back to trouble the living. And yet, not all spirits stayed at rest. Which brings us to a drink that was not offered in grief or honor, but in fear, a brew made for the sole purpose of keeping the dead exactly where they belonged. Let's dive into a protective drink ritual. Maybe a necromancy prevention drink or a superstitious anti-ghost brew. The silent supper of the monastery. The hall was dim, save for the glow of beeswax candles that lined the long oak table. The flames flickered lazily, their light pooling over earthenware bowls filled with steaming barley stew. Around the table sat the monks, dozens of them, each clad in coarse brown habits, heads bowed, faces calm. Not a single voice rose above the soft scrape of wooden spoons against clay. This was not just a mealtime. It was the silent supper, an act of devotion and discipline. Every movement, from lifting the spoon to tearing a hunk of bread, was slow and deliberate, as though each gesture was a prayer. Eating in total silence wasn't just about humility. They believed that speaking while chewing could invite sin. Words, they feared, might distract from the sacred duty of nourishing the body for the glory of God. And yet, beneath this solemn quiet, there was an undercurrent of unspoken tension. You see, the rules of the silent supper were so strict that even an accidental cough or sneeze could lead to penance. Imagine sitting there, barley steam in your nose, fighting the urge to sniffle, while the monk at the far end shot you a sharp look for moving too quickly. One wrong sound, and your evening might end with scrubbing the latrines, or worse, fasting the next day as punishment. Some monks took the ritual further. They practiced what was called mind fasting, a state where they would picture the food as nothing more than fuel, stripping away all pleasure from eating. A loaf of bread was not delicious, it was a vessel for survival. A spoonful of stew was not warm and savory, it was a humble gift to keep the flesh from failing. The idea was to break the bond between desire and food entirely, so the soul would rise above hunger itself. It might sound peaceful, serene even, but in reality, these suppers could be deeply unnerving. The air was thick with unspoken rules. The only sounds were the faint drips from a leaky roof and the occasional creak of the bench as someone shifted. You'd feel the weight of centuries of discipline pressing in on you, as though every meal here was happening both in the present and in some ancient, unbroken chain of quiet devotion. But here's the thing. As disciplined as these monks were, not every medieval meal was silent. In fact, just beyond the monastery walls, there were very different dining traditions. Meals where noise, chaos, and superstition ruled. Feasts that mixed food with bizarre omens and strange performances. And it's there, in that strange, noisy world, where our next scene begins. Let's step outside the candlelit stillness and into the raucous glow of a medieval banquet hall, where food wasn't just eaten, it was turned into a spectacle. Here, you might see pies hiding live animals, wine flowing like rivers, and a crowd gasping at a dish that seemed more like witchcraft than cooking. The spectacle of the banquet hall. If the monastery's dining hall was a temple of restraint, then the medieval banquet hall was a cathedral of chaos. The moment you stepped inside, the air changed. It was thick with the smell of roasted meats, spiced wine, and the faint tang of beeswax from hundreds of candles dripping onto gleaming silver candelabras. The walls were draped with rich tapestries depicting hunts, battles, and saints. Long trestle tables stretched the length of the room, covered in linen so white it seemed impossible that anyone here actually ate on it. At the far end, raised above the rest of the guests on a wooden dais, sat the lord and lady of the manor, resplendent in silks and fur, their goblets brimming with dark red wine. The feast was less about eating and more about showing off. Each course was paraded in with ceremony. You didn't just get a roasted pig, you got a roasted pig with an apple in its mouth, wearing a crown of rosemary and cloves, surrounded by sugared fruits. Servants, dressed in liveries that matched the Lord's coat of arms, carried in peacocks that had been roasted and then redressed in their own dazzling feathers. Sometimes, a dish would be pure theater, like a giant pie that, when sliced open, released a flurry of live birds that flapped through the hall to the astonishment of the guests. The noise was constant. Laughter, shouting, the clatter of trenchers and knives, the occasional drunken song. Wine and ale flowed freely, and every toast seemed to demand another drink. Between courses, jesters and musicians performed, juggling knives, playing lutes, reciting bawdy rhymes that had the servants snickering and the noblewomen pretending not to laugh. But it wasn't just about entertainment. Food itself was used to convey power. Spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and saffron were imported from distant lands at incredible expense. And serving them in abundance told every guest that their host's reach extended far beyond local fields. Sugar sculptures, molded into castles or mythical beasts, were as much a statement as they were dessert. Even the order of the dishes had meaning, symbolizing wealth, rank, and divine blessing. Of course, the banquet was also a stage for gossip. Noble alliances were whispered over platters of venison. Marriages were arranged between mouthfuls of glazed quail. And every guest watched the others carefully, because a misplaced comment, or refusal to drink when toasted, could be taken as an insult that might haunt you long after the last candle guttered out. Yet, amid all this splendor and excess, there was a strange, almost superstitious thread running through the night. Many believed certain foods carried omens. If your bread broke cleanly, it was good luck. If it crumbled in your hands, misfortune might follow. Drinking the last drop in a goblet without spilling was said to bring blessings, but if you splashed even a little onto the tablecloth, it was a sign of betrayal to come. And sometimes, the host would deliberately serve dishes linked to hidden meanings, just to see who caught the message. It was a world where every bite was loaded with symbolism, where the spectacle of the meal could make or break reputations. And as the last course was served, often a tower of spiced cake or a dish of gilded marzipan shaped like a crown, the energy in the room reached its peak. Guests leaned in closer, the music swelled, and eyes glittered in the candlelight. Transition to scene 17. But not every grand feast ended with laughter and music. In some corners of medieval life, food could become a weapon, a curse, or even a death sentence. And our next scene takes us to one of the most unsettling dining tables of the Middle Ages, where the meal wasn't meant to entertain, but to condemn. The spectacle of the banquet hall. If the monastery's dining hall was a temple of restraint, then the medieval banquet hall was a cathedral of chaos. The moment you stepped inside, the air changed. It was thick with the smell of roasted meats, spiced wine, and the faint tang of beeswax from hundreds of candles dripping onto gleaming silver candelabras. The walls were draped with rich tapestries depicting hunts, battles, and saints. Long trestle tables stretched the length of the room, covered in linen, so white it seemed impossible that anyone here actually ate on it. At the far end, raised above the rest of the guests on a wooden dais, sat the lord and lady of the manor, resplendent in silks and fur, their goblets brimming with dark red wine. The feast was less about eating and more about showing off. Each course was paraded in with ceremony. You didn't just get a roasted pig. You got a roasted pig with an apple in its mouth, wearing a crown of rosemary and cloves, surrounded by sugared fruits. Servants, dressed in liveries that matched the Lord's coat of arms, carried in peacocks that had been roasted and then redressed in their own dazzling feathers. Sometimes, a dish would be pure theater, like a giant pie that, when sliced open, released a flurry of live birds that flapped through the hall to the astonishment of the guests. The noise was constant. Laughter, shouting, the clatter of trenchers and knives, the occasional drunken song. Wine and ale flowed freely, and every toast seemed to demand another drink. Between courses, jesters and musicians performed, juggling knives, playing lutes, reciting bawdy rhymes that had the servants snickering and the noblewomen pretending not to laugh. But it wasn't just about entertainment. Food itself was used to convey power. Spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and saffron were imported from distant lands at incredible expense, and serving them in abundance told every guest that their host's reach extended far beyond local fields. Sugar sculptures, molded into castles or mythical beasts, were as much a statement as they were dessert. Even the order of the dishes had meaning, symbolizing wealth, rank, and divine blessing. Of course, the banquet was also a stage for gossip. Noble alliances were whispered over platters of venison. Marriages were arranged between mouthfuls of glazed quail. And every guest watched the others carefully, because a misplaced comment or a refusal to drink when toasted could be taken as an insult that might haunt you long after the last candle guttered out. Yet, amid all this splendor and excess, there was a strange, almost superstitious thread running through the night. Many believed certain foods carried omens. If your bread broke cleanly, it was good luck. If it crumbled in your hands, misfortune might follow. Drinking the last drop in a goblet without spilling was said to bring blessings, but if you splashed even a little onto the tablecloth, it was a sign of betrayal to come. And sometimes, the host would deliberately serve dishes linked to hidden meanings, just to see who caught the message. It was a world where every bite was loaded with symbolism, where the spectacle of the meal could make or break reputations. And as the last course was served, often a towering spiced cake or a dish of gilded marzipan shaped like a crown, the energy in the room reached its peak. Guests leaned in closer, the music swelled, and eyes glittered in the candlelight. But not every grand feast ended with laughter and music. In some corners of medieval life, food could become a weapon, a curse, or even a death sentence. And our next scene takes us to one of the most unsettling dining tables of the Middle Ages, where the meal wasn't meant to entertain, but to condemn. The funeral bread of the forgotten. Imagine you're walking through a medieval village at dusk. The air is damp, heavy with the smell of freshly turned earth and the faint tang of wood smoke. But there's something else, a sweet, yeasty aroma, drifting out of a small cottage near the edge of town. Inside, a family is baking bread. not for the living, but for the dead. This is no ordinary loaf. It's funeral bread, a strange and deeply symbolic custom practiced in parts of Europe for centuries. The idea was simple, yet chilling. Bread could carry blessings, memories, and even sins. When someone died, a special batch would be baked, sometimes round, like the cycle of life, other times shaped like a human body, tiny and crude. Once baked, the bread was placed directly on the chest of the deceased. The belief? That the warm, porous dough would absorb the sins of the dead, pulling them out like poison from a wound. After several hours, the bread was taken away, considered spiritually full. And then here's the disturbing part: it was eaten. Yes, eaten, often by a designated person known as a sin eater. This was usually someone poor, desperate, or an outcast, the kind of person society was already afraid of. For a few coins, they would consume the bread, along with the sins of the deceased, so the dead could enter the afterlife unburdened. But this role came with a curse. Sin eaters were believed to accumulate the weight of all those wrongdoings, corrupting their soul and shortening their lives. The atmosphere at these funerals was heavy, not only with grief, but with fear. People avoided looking directly at the sin eater as they tore off pieces of the bread, chewing slowly, their eyes hollow. Children whispered that you could see the darkness pass from the bread into the eater, a shudder, a twitch, a shadow behind the eyes. Sometimes, in more desperate or remote areas, the bread wasn't eaten at all. It would be buried deep under the hearthstone or tossed into the river, letting the sins drift far away from the village. But in every version of the ritual, bread wasn't just food, it was a spiritual vessel, a final bridge between the living and the dead. And the eerie part: if the ritual wasn't done, people believed the dead might linger, wandering as restless spirits, knocking on doors at night, bringing illness or crop failure. In a time where faith and fear were tangled so tightly, skipping a ritual was simply unthinkable. Now, speaking of the dead returning, our next stop takes us somewhere far stranger. Because in the next tradition, food wasn't just for the dearly departed, it was a way to keep something much worse from coming back at all. That brings us into scene 19, the feast that trapped the hungry ghost, where every bite was a lock and every plate a prison. The royal banquet of the unseen guests. Picture this: the grand dining hall of a medieval castle, its towering ceilings vanishing into shadow, lit only by the flicker of countless beeswax candles. Gold plates glimmer beneath the flames' dance, silver goblets catch the light like molten moonlight, and roasted meats send curls of steam spiraling into the cool air. Every seat at the massive oak table is taken, or so it appears. Because among the nobles, knights, and ladies in silk, there are seats set aside for guests who aren't exactly alive anymore. You see, in certain medieval courts, there was an unspoken belief that the spirits of ancestors attended these royal banquets. Plates of food, sometimes the choicest cuts, venison or pheasant, were placed before invisible diners. The living would raise toasts to them, bow slightly in their direction, and pretend to converse as if they were physically present. To refuse to serve these unseen guests was thought to bring famine, disease, or the mysterious loss of fortune, a phrase vague enough to make many lords shiver. And the truly eerie part: people claimed that if you sat in one of these spirit chairs by mistake, the seat would feel suddenly icy, as though a thin, unseen hand rested on your shoulder. Stories whispered in the candlelight told of wine glasses shattering on their own, or platters being pulled slightly across the table without anyone touching them. To those present, it wasn't a trick of the eye. It was proof the dead were feasting. The atmosphere during such moments was thick, not just with the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine, but with an almost tangible sense of someone watching. Guests, even the most skeptical, found themselves glancing sideways, half expecting to see a shadowy figure seated beside them. And once dessert was served, honey pastries and candied fruits, some would swear they heard faint murmurs, as though the dead were politely thanking their hosts. But here's where the banquet turns even stranger. These ghostly feasts weren't just for kings. Smaller villages had their own version, except instead of ghostly nobles, they left out plates for local spirits, fair folk, or even wandering souls who might be passing through. In some hamlets, the villagers claimed that failing to feed these invisible guests would lead to spoiled crops, soured milk, or sick livestock. And so, every year, they held midnight meals in barns, cellars, or crossroads, all in hopes that unseen hands would eat their fill and bless the community in return. Now, whether you believe these tales or not, one thing's certain: the medieval world was never just about what you could see. Their tables were as much for the living as they were for the dead. And while today's dinner parties might end with polite applause for the host, back then, they might end with an invisible touch brushing past your neck. And that brings us neatly to our next tale, a ritual that took the idea of sharing a meal and twisted it into something far more personal. Because in Scene 20, we step into a custom where the food you ate wasn't just meant to fill you. It was meant to bind you to someone forever, in life and in death. The Feast of the Blessed Bones. The great hall was thick with the smell of roasted meat, spiced wine, and something far less pleasant, i.e., a faint metallic tang that clung stubbornly to the air, as though the walls themselves had absorbed centuries of feasts gone wrong. Torches flickered in their sconces, casting unsteady shadows that danced across the long, groaning banquet table. At first glance, it looked like any medieval celebration. Goblets clinking, bread being torn in rough hands, and the low hum of drunken voices. But at the center of the table lay something different, something unsettling. A large, shallow dish piled high with pale, gleaming bones, sheep, boar, and, occasionally, if whispered rumors were to be believed, something else entirely. These weren't leftovers to be discarded. No, these bones were the main event. They were blessed bones, a bizarre and macabre relic from a long-forgotten festival. Each had been meticulously scrubbed clean, then rubbed with fragrant herbs, as though to disguise the fact that they were, well, bones. Once the guests had eaten their fill of meat and bread, the host, a pale, hawk-eyed man, with fingers heavy in gold rings, would lift a single bone high in the torchlight and begin a solemn, rhythmic chant. The others would respond in drunken unison, as though part of some ancient choir. Then, one by one, each guest was expected to take a bone, cradle it as one might a sacred object, and gnaw at whatever scraps still clung stubbornly to it. Some claimed the ritual granted good fortune for the winter months ahead. Others believed it kept illness at bay. But here's the strangest part after the feast. No bone was allowed to leave the hall. The scraps were burned in a small brazier, and the bones themselves were stacked in a neat, almost reverent pile in the corner. Over the years, the collection grew into a grotesque mountain, yellowed with age, silently watching every future feast. And as the flames consumed the scraps, casting eerie shadows on the vaulted ceiling, you might find yourself wondering, was this simply a quaint superstition? Or had these people stumbled upon something far darker, a charm not for good health, but for keeping something else away? Whatever the truth, the Blessed Bones ritual faded from history, but not before inspiring another tradition, one far stranger and far more dangerous. The Night of the Empty Plates. By the time the Blessed Bones ritual had fallen out of favor, the people of that cold, wind-scoured valley thought they had left the strangeness behind. But traditions in medieval Europe had a way of mutating, like a plant finding a new way to twist toward the sun. The bones may have been gone, but the fear, the belief that something unseen needed to be appeased, lingered. And so, a new custom emerged. It was called the Night of the Empty Plates. Once a year, after the first frost, every household was expected to set their dinner table as if for a feast, polished goblets, bread baskets, and steaming bowls of stew. Except no one would eat. Instead, the food was left untouched, and every seat around the table was occupied by an empty chair, facing inward, as though waiting for guests that had not yet arrived. The villagers claimed the ritual was meant to honor those who came before ancestors, saints, and wandering souls who needed guidance to find their way home. But in hushed whispers, away from the safety of the firelight, a darker theory was told. The plates weren't set for family. They were offerings for it. It was never named directly, only referred to as the Pale One. Supposedly, long ago, before the Blessed Bones were ever blessed, before the valley had even been tamed, something walked there. Tall, silent, patient, and it didn't like to be forgotten. On the Night of the Empty Plates, villagers would quietly leave their homes at midnight and walk to the edges of the frozen fields. They wouldn't speak. They wouldn't look back. The houses, lit only by a few guttering candles, sat like hollow shells in the dark, their tables groaning under the weight of untouched food. Sometimes, if the snow was fresh the next morning, there would be footprints. Not human, not animal. Too long, too thin. They'd begin at the tree line and end at a doorway. The family who lived there would be gone by morning. And yet the ritual continued year after year, not because it was loved, but because no one dared to not do it. You see, the one time the entire village agreed to skip the tradition, thinking themselves above old superstition, well, that winter didn't end. Not until the following summer's crops had rotted in the fields, and half the village had been buried under snow and silence. So when you hear the wind rattling your window on a cold night, and you think you see something pale moving out by the trees, remember, some medieval traditions weren't about community or faith or even food. They were about survival. The strange banquet that waited in the shadows. The air in that cold medieval hall still hung heavy with the echoes of punishment and whispered fear from the previous tales. You might think the people of that era would retreat to their beds after such ordeals. But no, the night was far from over. The torches lining the walls flickered, casting jittery shadows that stretched like long, crooked fingers toward the center of the room. And there, waiting on a table carved from ancient oak, was something that could chill your appetite and your soul. You see, in those days, food was never just food. It wasn't simply bread to fill your stomach or meat to keep you strong. No, it was a stage, a canvas, a vessel for beliefs so tangled in superstition that every bite could be an omen, every sip a spell. And when the church bells tolled at midnight, the feasting would begin, but not the kind of feasting you're imagining. No roasted chicken served with a polite blessing. Instead, these meals carried secrets and sometimes curses. Picture it. A pie the size of a wagon wheel, brought forth with a priest in attendance, not to bless it, but to watch. A silver goblet of wine passed from hand to hand, but each person murmuring a different incantation before they drank. A loaf of bread, so black it looked like it had been baked in the ashes of the condemned. Now, I know you might be wondering, why? Why take something as comforting as food and twist it into a performance of fear and magic? Well, that's exactly where we're headed next. Because the medieval world didn't see a meal as the end of a day, it saw it as a gateway, a threshold between the living and the dead, the blessed and the damned. And if you think the punishments we've just explored were unsettling, wait until you hear about the dishes that were served in complete silence, under candlelight, with no one daring to take the first bite until a raven tapped on the window. Wait until you hear about the blessing loaves that could either bring a year of prosperity or doom an entire family before the spring thaw. So, let's set aside the whip and the stocks for a moment and take a seat at the strangest dining table in history. Pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders because we're stepping into the world of creepy medieval food rituals, a strange tale to fall asleep to. The echoes of the last bizarre punishment fade, leaving us in that curious silence that comes after hearing too many strange stories in a row. It's the kind of silence where you're half expecting another shoe to drop. But instead, something else drifts into the room. Not the sound of chains or the creak of a dungeon door, but a faint, warm aroma. At first, you think it's just your imagination. But no, it's there, rich, heavy, and oddly sweet. A smell that doesn't belong in the dark corners of punishment chambers. Instead, it smells like kitchens, but not the cozy kitchens you know. These were medieval kitchens, where food wasn't just for eating. It was for ritual. Because you see, in the strange tapestry of medieval life, the same people who believed in drowning drunks and barrels and locking thieves in cages also believed that certain dishes could heal the soul, bless the harvest, or if prepared wrongly curse an entire village. So, picture this. A stone hall lit only by flickering tallow candles, long wooden tables sagging under the weight of strange and steaming platters. There's roasted boar, yes, but the head is decorated with fruits, herbs, and what looks disturbingly like coins pressed into its flesh. Servants move in silence, not daring to spill a drop of the spiced wine they pour into goblets, because this isn't dinner. It's an offering. In one corner, a priest chants softly over a bowl of milk and honey. In another, villagers tear bread in perfect silence, passing it from hand to hand, as if breaking it too roughly might invite disaster. These aren't simple meals, they are performances for unseen guests. And the creepiest part? No one at the table is entirely sure whether they are feeding saints, spirits, or something far less friendly. Some rituals were meant to protect, like baking a soul loaf that was left on the doorstep to feed wandering ghosts so they wouldn't trouble the household. Others were darker. There were tales of meat pies baked with animal hearts for courage, or stews brewed so thick with herbs that they were said to bring visions in your sleep. Visions that were not always pleasant. And the line between faith, superstition, and downright fear, well, let's just say it was as thin as the steam rising from those bowls. So, as our strange medieval journey shifts from iron chains to bread ovens, remember this: in those days, a meal could be just as dangerous as a sentence from the king. Next time, we'll dig even deeper into these eerie dining traditions, and you might just think twice before accepting an invitation to a medieval feast. If you've enjoyed this mix of creepy history and late-night storytelling, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and join our little community of curious night owls. Here, we wander through history's strangest shadows together, one bizarre story at a time. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.